funny. It was, of course, an illusion, because built-in obsolescence, I hadn't taken that into consideration. So, but I thought that I could use industrial enamel, paint on masonite, because I thought it would be safer and more lasting. Also, in this whole thing was the thought of maybe there was a contradiction there of trying to create repeatable paintings. I think the mic is gone, no? All right. Okay. Maybe that? No? Well, okay. Then
we're going to have to start shouting in addition to
there was a painting. I thought perhaps it was possible, after some terrible experience with paintings that destroyed themselves, to have paintings that could be reproduced. And one of the reasons to go to the circle at one time was to create a sort of modular unit or digit of information that could be repeated like notes of music. And I still remember when Sweeney came to pick a painting for the Guggenheim.
This is James Johnson
Yes.
Sweeney, the then director of the Guggenheim.
It had already been about a year old or something like that. It was beginning to yellow. I said, I'll have a new one for you tomorrow. He said, no, I want that, because there was still this feeling that a painting had to have the sort of the hand of the artist, and even if it yellowed or if it cracked, it wasn't original. And I think we've learned a great deal from the reproductive process. I think what is happening in lithography, what is happening in prints today, I learned a lot about it in my work with magazines, with the engravings and with the printing presses. And I think a lot of artists today have learned a lot from the printed medium.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that the piece on the right was entitled
Argo.
Argo, and it is still entitled Argo.
Yes.
When do you give works of art a title?
At the last desperate minute. If I can avoid giving a title, I would prefer it. And I think titles are terrible things. They're misleading, they're limiting, and they really mean nothing. They're just ways of identifying for facility of handling. It's very difficult to give a number. A number is awful. What do you do? How do you communicate that this piece? So you have to give it a title. So you think, well, maybe it's white, maybe it has some sail feeling. Let's call it Argo. But it has nothing to do with the original impulse or the experience that I hope the piece will have.
Nevertheless, I mean, it's obviously not intended to be a narrative of Jason and the Argonauts, but the fact that it's standing on a promontory, the fact that it's standing on a promontory at Newport, with that continuous shuttle of
you see, I didn't know
ships
that.
and mainsails
I didn't
in the
know
background.
when I named it. I didn't know it was going to be there. And now it's in Milwaukee. Now it's in Milwaukee on a piece of
every time I go to
land.
Milwaukee, I'll remember Newport.
Yes.
How does an artist get a commission? You said this monumental work had to be fabricated because of its size and its cost. How does one get a commission?
Well, I think, it started, let's say in this case, University of Pennsylvania had to spend 1%, I think it's 1%, of its building funds on art.
By law.
By law. So a number of sculptors and artists were commissioned. Tony Smith did a piece, several other artists, and there was a committee that met, selected the group of artists who were to be commissioned, and we were taken to the site. There was a big committee of 15 people. It's quite tedious. You have to go through the one committee, then you have to go through the city committee. They all have to approve before a certain piece is selected. Then, of course, comes the problem of manufacture. And in many cases, it's impossible for an artist involved in a monumental work to manufacture. So in this case, as it was the University of Pennsylvania, as Bethlehem Steel belongs to Pennsylvania, they decided perhaps they'd donate the steel and fabricate the piece.
You mean it's located in Pennsylvania?
Yes. So this is how it happens.
In other instances, it's even more obvious. Mr. Hughes is about to take on, I guess, what is called a commission as well, one for which he is uniquely qualified. If you will permit me, I will tell them that Mr. Hughes has just returned from a week in Europe, filming the first part of a television series. He now proposes to do for us and for civilization what Sir Kenneth Clarke did up until the 20th century. Mr. Hughes has taken on, I guess, from that period on, from the 20th century on.
It's a set of 9 programs.
For BBC.
For BBC.
Can you tell us something about them, its scope, its direction, what you have in mind, and how much control will you have over its content?
Complete control over the content. It's every so often the BBC wants to do a sort of large series. It is generally supposed, because the ones that you see in America are the good ones, like Civilization and America, and Bronowski's run The Ascent of Man, that all these series, that each one of these series is a sort of automatic blockbuster, which is by no means the case. There have been some that went down the tube completely, and God knows this one may be one of them. But anyway, the idea was that since Clarke finished, and Civilization itself, in Clarke's view, finished around 1900, that we should now do a set of programs involved with the barbaric and difficult period in which we all grew up. Now, because whereas Civilization had 13 programs in which to cover about 1,300 years, whereas...
What's the working title of your series?
We don't have a working title yet.
You had one last week.
No, there's no working title for it. Because the working title, I'm abandoning working titles. We've got to find a final title, and now that the cameras are rolling and we still haven't got a title, it's a source of great embarrassment to me. Yes, I know, it's frightful. I sympathise with you completely, Alex. If only I could call it Argo or call it Fred or something.
Actually, they're both superb names. I especially like Fred.
Fred is Fred.
Well, anyway, Fred will be 9 programs, each 1 hour. The original idea was that one would do a kind of chronological history of the static visual arts in the 20th century. In other words, painting, sculpture, architecture and photography, but not film and not music and not literature. The reason why not film is that, and the reason incidentally why none of us have ever seen what would be a terrific series to do, namely a sort of history of film, is that it is cripplingly expensive to do. I mean, with the copyright costs being what they are, if you want to, sort of run half a minute of a battleship Potemkin, it's going to cost you $7,000. And if you want to run half a minute of Barbara Streisand, it's going to cost you, well, I think she'd figure large in the history of film, but nevertheless, if you did, it would cost you probably $30,000. And so consequently, we are confined to the static visual arts, which in fact doesn't suit the theme too badly, because one of the sort of principal themes of this series is the birth and flowering and subsequent decay of what you might call the heroic dream or fantasy of modernism, which was that by changing the language of the visual arts, you will thus pull the rug out from underneath established modes of conduct and behaviour and political rapport and so on and so forth, and in this way transform the world. This illusion gave birth to some of the most marvellous painting and sculpture and thought of our century. And it's only now, I think probably in the last 10 years, that it's finally become clear to just about everybody that since people no longer get their essential information about the way that they conduct themselves in the world, how they articulate their attitudes and how they bring their minds to bear upon their problems from looking at paintings and sculpture, but rather get it as they once did, say in the 14th or even in the 16th or the 17th centuries. We no longer have works of art which can, static works of visual art which can move people to action in quite the same way that Rubens, for instance, hoped that his allegories would promote the cause of peace in Europe. And
that's a view somewhat fostered by some of your own writings. In fact, I'd like to quote something that you said, if I may.
By all means, yes. But no, just let me finish the sentence.
Please.
I'm leaving a clause dangling in midair, and it's this, that now that this has been usurped by other media, cinema, television, and so on and so forth, we can actually talk about, if we talk about a history of the avant-garde, we can talk about a closed period. So, you know, my period for the series is 1870 to 1970, from Courbet's part in the destruction of the Vendôme column, let us say, to the Scow auction.
You said that art does not morally improve us.
No.
It does not politically reform us.
No.
No life is made easier by contact with it.
That's true.
What does art offer?
I disagree.
Please do. First let him tell us what art offers, and then please do disagree.
What it offers is a greater articulation of our senses. It offers probably it doesn't politically reform us, but it may marginally enable us to act more coherently in the world. And it gives us delight. And it fills all sorts of things which were not full of meaning to us before, and which didn't have a name, and which cannot have their meanings explicated in words. It fills those things with meaning. But it does not make us morally better. You disagree, Alex?
I disagree.
How does it make us morally better?
Well, I don't know if it does, but that's the artist's hope. That's what art is about.
Do you feel that it has made you morally better?
Not me. It has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the work itself. That perhaps in trying to achieve this spiritual experience, perhaps it will help me when the work is done. One becomes a spectator of one's own work later on. But basically, I think the content of art is a moral content and a spiritual content, the content of abstract art. And I think it was true even of realistic art. I think all art should basically be religious, in my opinion, and bring out a different experience of life by withdrawing human beings from the reality of life into a different realm.
I couldn't agree with you more. The problem is that although art is ideally, you know, sort of, I mean, a great deal of art is ideally religious in this way. I keep on thinking, for instance, you know, I mean, one of the great, you know, sort of, I suppose, metaphysical artists that ever lived, the greatest that ever lived was Piero della Francesca.
Yeah. Not the great.
Well, no, one of the greater ones, one of the greater, and certainly, I mean, there's a very strong sort of articulating drive in Piero, you know, and yet, nevertheless, this man whose works clearly, you know, I mean, are clearly directed right at a kind of Neoplatonic take on the world, the idea that, you know, one becomes united in harmony with an ideal cosmos through the laws of perspective and so forth. The man who was his principal patron was Sigismondo de Malatesta, one of the greatest demons in the history of Italian politics. And yes, but you see, the thing is that clearly, you know, Piero did not reform him.
Well, but he's reforming us and you. Because
well, I don't know. He's certainly acting on me in some way, but I doubt that he makes me politically or morally better.
I think it does. I think
During the course of our lifetimes, not only have we had various views of the role of art, obviously you think that art can be political as well, Alex.
Well, I think there is I think all artists, if they have any, are involved with the reality of life that surrounds them.
Yes, art can be. I mean, some of the greatest art in the world is political. But my point rather is that at the same time, you know, I mean, the early years of the 20th century are those years in which you get the most heroic efforts on the part of artists. I mean, think of the Russian constructivists, to work hand in hand with what they sincerely believed to be a new world that was being born in Russia, where they were living. And their efforts were all directed to working hand in hand with the makers of the revolution and with the ideology of the revolution towards the transformation of the life of the people of Russia. Nevertheless, within 6 years of the revolution, their work was snuffed out, it was shoved in the basements, and what Russia got was Stalin. Now, if this does not in any way denigrate, the passion of their commitment or the beauty of their work, but it indicates simply that, some of the very finest revolutionary art does not have practical political consequences.
Alex, you are restraining yourself?
No, not restraining at all. But I mean, you're touching an essential subject, the subject of freedom.
Yes.
And I think the real essence of serious art is this freedom, the freedom of the individual. And I think the great meaning of art or message of art is usually a message of protest when the artist has been involved. Now, this is why it has been suppressed, because it usually has been against the grain, either just by implying an idealism or by implying a different concept of life. It had to be stopped. This is where the moral purpose, I think the constructivists believed in a better world, they believed in the idealistic part of the revolution, and that was too much. It had to be stopped.
During the course of our lifetimes, and I hope during the course of your series as well, you will touch on obviously various geographical locations that have been leading centers for art. Obviously what springs to mind is Paris in the 20s, Provincetown in the 40s, New York in the 60s. Where is it at now?
Me or Alex?
You first.
I don't think there is a centre. I think there's a centre of the market, but I don't think there's any single centre of defined aesthetic activity, because actually, Paris was a centre of art in the 20s. Certainly, let's say in 1918, Paris was a centre of art, but also equally, Moscow was a centre of art. Don't forget, a lot of the art history of our time has been written by Parisians, and so
you think it's revisionist?
Just as a great deal of the art history, in fact, a startling amount of the art history of the last 25 years has been written by New Yorkers, and these, sort of tremendous chauvinist biases do occur. I would like to dispense with the, what interests me is what cultures have in common, and how similar ideas crop up. They flower, as constructivism did simultaneously all over Europe between the years roughly the years 1915 and 1930. And why these simultaneous flowerings, like Arthur Koestler described this phenomenon where you have an invention which is made simultaneously, or a scientific discovery which is made simultaneously by a lot of people, well, not a lot, but 3 or 4 people who were not actually in contact with one another.
Who've never seen each other's work.
Never seen each other.
Not influenced or
yes,
derivative.
and the sort of phrase that he denotes this with is the ripeness of an idea. There it is, this fruit, and it is going to drop into several hands simultaneously, and it's that rather than this sort of I think imperiled by chauvinism sort of idea of the centre here now and this other centre here then that I like examining.
Alex, do you think that New York is still necessary, or is there the growth of these vital art communities throughout? Is New York just an art market, as I think you inferred?
No, I didn't say it was just an art market.
But primarily?
If you can talk about New York being an indispensable centre, it is an indispensable centre of the market. But there are people all over America painting and sculpting remarkable things, and as there are all over the world, and there is no longer the feeling that, like Frenchmen in the 18th century, they had to go to Rome in order to study the antique.
Don't you think they still have to go to New York?
Yes. Yes, I think it's desirable to go to New York, but it doesn't have
don't you think it's a question of means? I have to bring this up. I mean, artists today...
Excuse me, Alex, do you think that you can...
Oh.
Yes.
I mean, there's a question of... You see, I've always believed that art gravitates towards power. And historically, it seemed to me, always, power meant money, power meant means to buy marble for Michelangelo, get a commission from the Pope, whatever that center was.
Yes.
And I think today, if an artist wants to create the technological ability of finding things, the ease with which certain things can be done in New York, are much greater than Paris. It doesn't mean the art is by necessity better, but an artist can do more.
I think this is certainly true of an artist such as yourself, who is dependent upon a fairly advanced and complex steel technology involving engineers and surplus metal and so on and so
take
forth.
duck canvas. I mean, if it hadn't been, you can't find it in Paris. You cannot find a roll of 10-foot canvas.
The lyric acrylic on the Lucky Duck. Yeah.
Well, whatever, you can't find it. So without duck and the rolls of duck canvas, you wouldn't have had the New York School of Art.
No, that's true.
I mean, that's the technological necessity. Acrylic paint is barely available in Paris. It's only beginning after 20 years of American discovery. And if you hadn't had, the acrylic, the duck canvas, you would have stayed at the level of, which is a great level, I mean, of Matisse or Picasso, but the breakthrough of a Pollock or Rothko or Newman, I don't think would have been possible.
But duck is available all over America today.
Oh, yes.
I mean, there is no...
America, all over America, but not Europe.
Not Europe.
Not Europe.
Not Europe.
But for an artist to make it, so to speak, does he ultimately have to make it in New York to be considered a
That's another
success?
matter.
Yeah, that is another matter, as Alex says. I don't know. I'm not fudging the question. I honestly don't know. I mean, there are a couple of artists I know in Paris who certainly haven't made it in New York, but are, sort of considered in the term. Choice.
Has their work suffered as a result if they haven't worked or exhibited here?
I don't believe so. I mean, I'm sure that there are certain artistic temperaments, there are certain temperaments, period, to whom living in a city like Manhattan is simply uncongenial. And probably wouldn't work
Or else
very
in
well, I think.
proximity.
Look at California. I mean,
Look at
they're an
California.
extraordinary group of artists.
Yeah. And believe me, they wouldn't want to live in Manhattan if you handed it to them with a year's free supply of sunlight soap.
And some of the Manhattan artists would not want to live in California.
You're dead right. And some of the Manhattan critics wouldn't want to either. I mean,
We
we're
were
all
talking
deformed by our...
earlier about New York as a market. I think there was an earlier time when we spoke of art appreciation, what we meant was the enjoyment and delight of works of art. Obviously, there is a creeping commercialization of the art world, and more when we talk about art appreciation, we are talking about investments.
It creepeth not, it gallopeth.
How has that whole marketplace atmosphere affected the quality of artistic productivity? First, let's ask the critic and then the artist. Unless you'd like to reverse the order.
But you see, Liberman is the man who knows about the quality of artistic productivity, because he's an artist, and I'm the one who knows about what effects it has on consumption. Well, we both know a little about each. Yeah. Do you want to go first?
No, you go.
Go on, Alex.
I really don't know.
Does it actually affect your work as a sculptor or a painter?
What?
The exacerbated attention that everybody in New York pays to the market and to prices and to investment.
Well, the new and broader marketplace for art.
Yeah.
Well, I think the broader the market, the better for the artists in general. I think without the quantity of artists in Paris, without the quantity, let's say, of less good artists or bad artists, you wouldn't have had the flowering of French art. I believe the more art there is, the more involvement with art, the better chances there are that good art will emerge.
Well, let's extend
So
it.
I think the more that can happen in galleries, in publications, the more sales, and without judgment of quality. I think it's always a great mistake to judge too much. I think forgive me, but I mean, that's your profession.
I just rattle on.
Well, let's extend it a bit, Alex, and talk about what we're really talking about is the relationship between art and money.
Well, it's a very difficult one because I mean, if you're not amongst the few artists who sell, I would think the life of an artist is a very difficult one. Also, if the galleries do not show you, how do you manage to get an income? That's why I think most of the great advanced avant-garde artists of America, from Newman to Rothko, had to have either a teaching job or their wives worked. I mean, there was always a necessity, unfortunately. And even Matisse's wife, he lived off her income because she designed hats for many, many years. So there's always this problem of income. Where does it come from? In my case, I was lucky up to a point, because now I trap myself with the scale, but to have a separate income from my work. And what does an artist do?
How does society nourish, in this country, in this point in time, its artists?
I think it tends to destroy them, but I've said this to you before, but I think that's part of what you were saying, a certain image of misery that seemed to be a necessity, and historically not true. I mean, the financial problem of art today is a very, very serious, difficult problem. And because materials are expensive, I mean, how does one, and I think it's going to be more and more difficult. And unless there's a new WPA or some government-supported work, I mean, I don't think artists really want to make money out of art. Very few do. I think they want to be able to be allowed to create and to produce to lead a decent life, and create. It's not a question of making money. Now, galleries have to make money, otherwise they couldn't run the galleries.
Remember that remark of Blake's, about the against Reynolds, liberality, sir, we want not liberality, we want a decent income for the day's work.
Sure.
And that essentially is it. I mean, I'm not at all convinced, I would like to believe that what you say is true, Alex, that, artists don't want to make money off their work, but on the other hand, why should artists not want to make money off their work? Everybody else wants to make money off their work.
Actually, we're also directing our question to something beyond the role of the artist.
Yes,
the whole marketplace aura. You have some rather strong views about that relationship.
Well, yes, I do. You see, I think one of the sort of weird little symbolic turning points in journalism, in cultural journalism, and therefore in a mild way in American culture, occurred in 1963 when the Metropolitan Museum bought Rembrandt's Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer for what then seemed the staggering price of $2.3 million. I mean, it's the price of a pollock these days, but...
only in Australia.
Only in Australia, that's true. Oh, no, in Washington, you see, Washington refuses to admit that they paid 2.7 for Lavender Mist, but they did. Now, when that happened, of course, it hit everybody like a bomb. And one of the effects of it was that time, which is not given to running covers on the board, and especially not then was given to running covers on artists. I mean, we hadn't had a cover on an artist for, I think, 12 years. We did have Andrew Wyeth. Time came out with this reproduction of Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer with a gold border instead of the usual red border around it. And
should have been green.
There was and then suddenly, this tremendous feeding frenzy, as of sharks in an aquarium, was on. Every time from that, that any, I'm not talking about serious critics, but suddenly it became, there was a sudden rush in the number of articles that got written about art and about artists, and the tenor of every single interview that was conducted with an artist or a critic or anybody else from that point on by the working daily press was, always at some point involved with the investment status of works of art.
But isn't that historically true as well? Certainly in the 20s and 30s, when great collections were built in this country and then palaces to house them, there was certainly a direct relationship between that work of art and its potential for investment.
The great collections like Frick's and Isabella Stewart Gardner's and so and
Mellon and Havmeyer and Widener.
And Widener were not, I think, primarily bought with the intention of reselling them. They were bought for other reasons. Now, I don't mean that all these fine railroad barons and and tin kings were acting through purely altruistic motives, but it was not primarily a form of investment as it became in the 60s. There was so much focus upon the price of works of art, particularly on the price of major works of art in museums, that suddenly a large museum-going audience found it very hard to see...
Which is also a new audience.
Which was a new museum-going audience. Because the four museums have been much more articular and private, and people didn't, not as many people went to them as they do now. Suddenly, this veil of dollar signs landed in front of the work that they were contemplating, if it was a star work. I mean, I think it took years for people, it's terribly difficult to give statistics on this. I mean, this is an impression, but it's an impression, that I get from 20 years as a journalist, and so I really offer it for what it's worth. That the market value, supposed or real, of major works of art struck people blind. It made it excessively difficult for them to look at the object as an image which was intended to convey meanings in the same way as all works of art have always conveyed meanings. Suddenly there was a pair of golden parentheses around the star object. And the result of this was that the normal, if you might say, relationship that a wide audience had to a work of art became intensely frustrating, because you see, the very essence of museums is that you can go in there and you can look at a work of art, and you can for a time possess it in the only way in which a work of art can be meaningfully possessed, that is to say, with the eyes, the emotions and the intellect. And suddenly this alienating screen of surplus value was invested upon the star object. And it became, it suddenly went into a different order of existence. It became simultaneously terribly enviable, terribly remote, different in an unspecified kind of way, unapproachable, and that kind of meaningless anal aura with which it was invested, became, then a characteristic, spread to all other works of art. And this situation we have not yet shaken free from, and I think, in decrying it, obviously, I think, Alex, I'm not saying that our living artists should not be paid for their work, or that, some, don't deserve to be paid more for their work than others, or anything of the sort. All I'm saying is that, large prices distort public perception of what are, in fact, aesthetic and sensual values.
How about large crowds? Among other things, both of you in your journalism lives help create ever-increasing numbers of people who went to museums. Do you find that alienating as well in terms of viewing a work of art? The museum as community center?
Well, look, if we could approach it as a parable, right? Okay, 100 years ago you have Yellowstone, you have Yosemite Gorge, and the explorer stumbles into it. What sublimity, how marvellous, he has it to himself. People go to visit it over a period of time, they have it to themselves. A whole conception of American nature is born from this. There is a vast sublimity there for the taking. Lots and lots of people get to hear about it. Naturally, it is their right as citizens of a democratic republic to go to Yosemite Gorge. So that in 1977, if you go to Yosemite Gorge, there are Winnebago campers stacked bumper to bumper and side to side as far as the eye can see. Now, all of these people who go there for their holidays are absolutely right to do so, and there's no reason why they shouldn't. And also they believe, because they never saw it when it was otherwise, that that what they're getting is an experience precisely analogous to that which, people like, say, Thomas Moran, the painter, got when he painted Yosemite. But the fact is that they're not getting the same thing. Now, now I think there is a definite analogy here with museums, because...
Are you suggesting that museums should be temples of silence?
Yeah, they should be temples of silence. My bloody oath they should be. And they should be places in which, you know, they should afford as much opportunity as possible for people to have the only relationship with the work of art which counts. Looking at works of art is not a group experience. It is something that happens between you and it. And it is not improved by having a whole lot of people around. In fact, you know, the more people as anybody who's been to the Uffizi in high summer can testify. Having to look at that Botticelli past the armpits of 3,000 German tourists is one of the most dispiriting confrontations between the real and the ideal that you can possibly have. And there is absolutely no way, you see, of adjusting a work of art in such a way that it can be looked at simultaneously by a large number of people without in some way getting really screwed up.
Now, what happens to the artist who wants ever-increasing numbers of people to be available to works of genuine quality and distinction, namely, at least his work? How do you feel about that, all of these people converging?
I think it's very healthy, but I think
It's always the egalitarian. That's the big surprise.
It's egalitarian Russian aristocrat. There's this Australian...
He muttered some aristocrat.
No, I mean, I hope that nobody interprets my point to mean that...
We never said elitist.
Oh, but I am an elitist. Certainly I am.
A cultural elitist? How do you define that?
I'm an elitist in the, you know, for one simple reason. I think that some people do given things better than others, and this has always been the case in the world, and it always will be, and the works of people who do things better than some others are usually more interesting to look at than the work of the others, you know, and I just don't see any way past this. You know, I mean, I passionately believe in human inequality. Not inequality of opportunity, but simply, in fact, you know, an inequality of performance, because we see it around us all the time. It always has been there. It's not an excuse for constructing ridiculous star ratings, but it's just a, you know, sort of determining factor of, you know, human life.
Can I say a small thing? You know, I've heard so many times people say, God, you know, Venice is appalling, all these tourists crowding San Marco, etc. I look at it totally differently. I go to Venice, I love Venice.
But you've looked at it for years. Would you comment on your photographing it?
No, I won't comment on that.
Please.
But the point is that I find when I see a big crowd on Piazza San Marco, I think I'm in the Middle Ages, and I think possibly the crowd in those days looked like this. It was animated, it had life. I personally like art to be involved with people, and that's why in many of my attempts at sculpture, I try to get people not to create an object. When you say it's architectural, maybe it's architecture is a device to involve people with an object. And I think the attempt is to get people to penetrate the experience of entering St. Peter's in Rome. And when you raise your head and you suddenly see this explosion of space, is a vital experience, and the human presences, whatever they are. You see, I think modern costume is as interesting as the Middle Age costume. There's a variety and a richness to it, and there's life, and I think it brings the reality of art to us in a very interesting way.
But Alex, when you speak of St. Peter's, I mean, you're absolutely right there, because, you know, architecture is essentially a public and participatory art. I mean,
so is sculpture.
And so is sculpture, and particularly sculpture of that size.
Yes.
You have to you have to walk around it. You
get
into
walk
through it. You know, and it's nice if there are people around it, because, you know, they can't physically obstruct your view of it. Piazza San Pietro without people in it is meaningless. You know, it is a great social space. But
you see, I'm glad that the museums spend the money in order to bring to a greater number of human beings a masterpiece that would have been locked up in some private collection.
So am I.
So otherwise people wouldn't see it.
Yes, so am I.
So,
even if it's 17 seconds.
I'm sorry if it's 3 million. It's none of my business. What I'm interested in is that human beings are exposed to a masterpiece, and through exposure, even if it's through the armpits of tourists, they still get a glimpse that is an enriching glimpse and brings them something else that is essential.
Absolutely, it's better to see it than not to see it.
Yes,
The question
okay.
is, the conditions, the further question...
Ideal conditions.
What are ideal conditions? David Sylvester, an English critic, once proposed a very interesting idea to the Tate, which was that they should try the experiment of having an exhibition in which there would be a number of small closed spaces, each of which would contain a work, a Giacometti, a Rothko, a Pollock, whatever, And one person at a time would be admitted into this space, and he would not be, or she would not be let out until 10 minutes had elapsed. And it was the most unpopular idea.
One last question. I wonder if you'd give us a glimpse of your appraisal of, historically, of some artists. You mentioned Rubens before.
Yes.
And I know he's an artist whose work you particularly respond. Where do you think, can you comment on Rubens?
One of the reasons why one of the reasons why I really like Rubens so much is that he is, to talk about liking Rubens as an impertinence. I mean, the man is there like the pyramids, or rather, the work is there, more fragile. Rubens was the supreme example of the artist as public man. The work was intended to play first of all, a man educated to his fingertips, who had this immense vocabulary, this enormous visual vocabulary, just, right at the end of his hand, as a result of, sort of continuous drawing from the antique when he was in Rome. And, later in Antwerp, he had this vast fund of material that he could use. It was not, at the time, during his lifetime, a very pressing... The question of originality was not a pressing matter in the 17th century. It was assumed that every artist spends, his apprenticeship in salutary acts of homage to his masters, and is not locked in a kind of Oedipal battle with them. And so consequently Rubens was able to take with a complete feeling of equanimity and freedom from everybody, from the Apollo Belvedere to the Laocoon, through Michelangelo and so on and so forth. I mean, he was in his own way as eclectic as Picasso, except that he stood within the tradition that on which he drew much more easily and indeed rather more fruitfully than Picasso. It was never an adversary relationship to the material. And yet,
Courbet? I'm just going to ask you about two other artists because I know there's another class that has to come in here.
Courbet?
Courbet, so to speak. Courbet?
Tremendous painter, tremendous maker of surfaces. I mean, and also great, a great maker of social meanings for a work of art. A truly brave man.
De Kooning, your great influence?
It's hard to give capsules, de Kooning's one of the, I think, everybody would probably agree that he is one of the sort of half dozen best draftsmen that's ever worked in America. And there is just this sort of, what I like in art above all else is energy, which, as Blake said, is eternal delight. The three artists you've mentioned are great radiators of energy.
I think, as are the two of you, you said before that it's quite obvious that some people do things with greater excellence than others. You've both made that manifestly clear tonight. Special thanks to you, Alex Liberman, and to you, Robert Hughes, for joining us. And thank you, class. Please understand that tonight, because of the difficulty that we had with the logistics, the camera, and so on, we did not have the usual opportunity to have the class ask questions. That will not occur, and thank you for your patience, too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara Lee.
Really.
You were great.
Thank you.
No, you really were wonderful. Oh, of course. I decided that I was more interested in so now we have about, an hour and 40 minutes. Oh, wonderful. I'm actually an Alaska magazine publisher. I want them to yes.
I'm very sorry.
No problem.
What should we do?
You just leave it and they'll take it. Yes, wait, let me do that.